Hello and welcome to Real Economy. The economic cost of Russia's war in Ukraine is hitting Europe hard. The economy had been on a path of strong growth and recovery coming out of the pandemic. But now the EU has cut its forecast for growth from 4% to 2.7% and hiked its inflation forecast. Coming up, Guillaume Desjardins is in Germany, where manufacturing companies dependent on metal parts from Ukraine are struggling. But first, here's your crash course on just how far-reaching the impact of the war is.
The EU's economy is feeling the impact of Russia's war in Ukraine. There's been a new surge in energy prices, driving inflation to record highs. Ukraine and Russia produce almost a third of the world's wheat and barley and are major exporters of metals. Disruption to these supply chains, as well as rising costs for many raw materials, have pushed up the cost of food and other basic goods and services. This puts a strain on businesses and less money in our pockets. The EU has cut its economic growth forecast from 4 to 2.7% for this year and from 2.8 to 2.3 for next year. Inflation, forecast at 3.9% just a few months ago, is now expected to average 6.8%.
The war is hurting some EU economies more than others. Germany's growth forecast is one of the lowest at 1.6%. Guillaume Desjardins headed to Bavaria, where manufacturing companies have been taking a hit.
Germany's Mittelstand, or mid-sized companies, are its economic backbone. But this ecosystem of local firms is also heavily dependent on neighbouring countries, including Ukraine. 5 kilometres, that's the average length of cables inside your car. And if your car is made in Europe, about 7% of this comes from Ukraine. In 2021, the European Union imported €760 million worth of Ukrainian cable. Most of that went to the car industry, but the aerospace sector is also reliant on it. Although this rocket factory doesn't get its supplies directly from Ukraine, when Russia invaded its neighbour in February, its whole supply chain was turned upside down.
Our suppliers, they have difficulties to get certain things. We see logistics prices increasing for the shortage of containers, hopefully a temporary problem. We see energy prices increasing, obviously, as well, hopefully also a temporary effect. But yeah, there are certain things that do affect business, but more our supply chain than us.
If it's to launch its first rocket into space in 2023 as scheduled, then the company will need to get creative. They are now adapting parts and components produced for other industries to use in their rockets, as these are easier to get hold of.
There are suppliers who are coming back with higher pricing or longer lead times, sure, and then we need to find alternatives. There are always alternatives. We don't have any single sources, but this requires more time and more effort, definitely on the supply chain management on our side.
The aerospace industry is not the only sector being affected by supply chain disruption. After 2 years of pandemic, the long-awaited economic recovery is now in the balance, especially as people feel the pinch across Europe due to rising prices. The European Commission has forecast an inflation rate of 6.5% for Germany this year, a record high since the country's reunification in 1990.
Households are losing power in consumption, so they will have to scale back. For the company, it's a relative loss of competitiveness, especially for the companies who are located in Germany. We have to bear the burden of these higher energy prices, and they can pass it on to a certain extent, but not all of it.
As growth stalls and prices rise, the EU hopes that the €800 billion pandemic recovery plan will help contain the situation. But the economic clouds of uncertainty are likely to remain in the weeks and months ahead as war rages in Ukraine.
Well, to talk more about this, I'm going to speak to economist Maria de Mertzis. She's the Deputy Director at Bruegel, a Brussels-based think tank that specialises in economics. Welcome to Real Economy.
Thank you for having me.
Has the war in Ukraine fundamentally changed the economic outlook for Europe, or has it more exaggerated economic issues that were already there?
I think probably the latter. It has exaggerated, certainly when it comes to inflation. The reason why we're seeing all this inflation is indeed energy, and energy coming from Russia. It's affected Europe a lot more than it's affected the US, because we depend on Russia a lot more than others do. It depends, of course, on the outcome of the war and how quickly we're going to find alternatives in Europe. Obviously, we can't do it overnight. On the outlook for growth, I think, we are coming out of a pandemic. Well, dare I say we are still in a pandemic, but at least the economy is coming out of the pandemic. We had huge increases in growth as a result of that. That has now been tamed a little bit, but we don't see a fundamental change there.
So for people watching, they're seeing their energy bills going up, the cost of living, the cost of food is rising. Should we just be prepared for more of this?
I think, yes, I think we're certainly going to have another year of this in terms of the inflation being abnormal. We have seen here in Belgium, where I live, an increase of flour, a doubling of flour, which of course has got implications for the price of bread, quite important. We'll feel it in our pockets when we refuel our cars, when we buy our weekly food. And I dare say that things probably need to get a little bit worse before they get better. So in that respect, I think we really need to brace ourselves for a little bit more of this.
And is this higher inflation a genuine concern, or is it just that we're nervous after such a long period of low inflation?
Well, I think it depends what you compare it to. If you compare it to the past 10 years, yes, that's we got used to very low rates of inflation. But it's not a problem if you compare it to the 1970s, when we were talking about real stagflation and inflation rates of 15% and negative growth. We don't have these numbers now. I don't expect to see those numbers even in the worst case scenario. But of course, we should stay short of forecasting these types of things. They're very difficult to forecast.
Do we need to see interest rates going up?
I think it's going to be very difficult for the ECB not to increase interest rates, or indeed other central banks that have to manage their own interest rates, when we are seeing inflation of the orders of magnitude that we're seeing.
How concerned are you about Europe's economy right now?
I think the European economy has weathered the pandemic crisis quite well. Now, of course, the new crisis is of a very different nature, and it is one that it will affect also the way we can cooperate globally, which of course have economic repercussions. I think the European economy is in a good position to wear this off. Now, whether we'll manage it depends, of course, also how the war itself develops.
Many thanks indeed for being with us on Real Economy.
Thank you.